Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we've got another video in our ship comparison series, this time comparing USS Forrestal to Battleship New Jersey. Today's video was brought to you by a generous donation from the Varelis family as a happy birthday to their patriarch who served on board USS Forrestal. So happy birthday, Mr. Varelis. Thank you for your service. Forrestal was the first supercarrier in the world, and at the time of her construction, the largest warship yet built. In terms of warships, she's only been surpassed by later supercarriers. So how does an Iowa Class battleship stack up to a vessel like this? Before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the supercarrier concept. Supercarrier is a term that refers to modern angled deck aircraft carriers that are capable of carrying jet aircraft. They can carry up to about 100 airplanes, much like World War II fleet aircraft carriers, but these aircraft are the larger, heavier jets. They have the ability to have both catapults and arrestor cables so that they can launch aircraft conventionally, as opposed to some modern carriers that only operate vertical takeoff and landing, or short takeoff and landing, or ski ramps. Some people argue that the United States is the only country to operate supercarriers, and so far I believe that is true. I don't consider the other large carriers other nations have made to be true supercarriers. And the United States has operated a number of classes of these, starting with Forrestal. But there was a design before Forrestal. At the end of World War II, the Midway-class aircraft carriers come online, which solve many of the issues of World War II-type fleet carriers, at least for the United States. And because of their massive size, they're about the same weight as an Iowa Class battleship as first built, they are capable of carrying significantly more propeller-driven aircraft than even the World War II era fleet aircraft carriers, with somewhere around 120 or more aircraft on board. Post-World War II, a couple of things happen now. Jet aircraft begin to be developed and begin to be put to sea, and these aircraft are significantly larger and heavier, which means that the conventional flight decks don't work, the conventional elevators don't work, the conventional catapults don't work, and conventional hangar spaces may not be large enough, and the flight decks just don't have as much space. So all of a sudden, these aircraft carriers that are carrying 100 or 120 planes during World War II, or 120 planes of World War II vintage, can now only carry about 50 jets, and it takes significant modification to do that. And none of them can carry jets large enough to carry the early nuclear warheads. Post-World War II, the U.S. military significantly downsizes because future wars are going to be fought with nuclear weapons. And so the only branch of service that matters is the branch that can deliver nuclear warheads around the world. And in 1945, that branch is what will become the United States Air Force, then the Army Air Corps. So the Navy is struggling to find an aircraft that's big enough to carry nuclear warheads and then a platform that's large enough to deploy that carrier. And so there are a ton of funding battles in the late 40s and early 50s between the various branches of service, and the Army comes out with artillery that can launch nuclear warheads, and the Navy comes up with the idea of USS United States, the first supercarrier. And she is authorized, and she is laid down, and then she's immediately canceled as a way to save money. She was supposed to be the first of 5 aircraft carriers that would have been the first supercarriers. And the Navy is much displeased by this. The Secretary of the Navy resigns. A bunch of admirals either resign or are forced to resign for speaking out against national policy. And so the idea is shelved for a couple of years, and it continues to be refined. And then Finally, in 1952, the United States authorizes the ship which will become known as USS Forrestal. She is the first of 4 ships, the others being Saratoga, Ranger, and Independence, all named for World War II aircraft carriers which had been taken out of service, except Forrestal herself, of course. And the first ship in the class is launched in 1954 and commissioned in 1955. The cost is about $217 million, which is roughly twice that of an Iowa Class battleship from a decade or a decade and a half earlier. The size also exceeds that of the Iowa Class battleships, with a 60,000-ton normal displacement is built and full load displacement around 80,000 tons. The ship size in just about every way dwarfs an Iowa. At 1,067 feet long, she's almost 200 feet longer. And at 258 feet wide, she's 150 feet wider. She draws 37 feet, which is a little bit less than an Iowa Class battleship, and she won't fit through the Panama Canal. But that is accepted. By this point, aircraft carriers have gone around the Straits of Magellan, and the U.S. Navy is planning on building enough of these, and with the Essex-class carriers already in service, they have enough that they can keep permanent fleets in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The ship will be able to operate about 90 aircraft and was originally armed with 8 5-inch guns in a layout very similar to earlier Ranger and Yorktown-class carriers, with 2 on each corner. The ship's steam turbines can produce 260,000 shaft horsepower, so about 40,000 more than an Iowa-class battleship, and this is enough to get the ship around 33 knots, same speed as an Iowa, at that much heavier displacement. Between her crew complement and her air group, the ship has a crew of more than twice that of an Iowa-class battleship. So, the U.S. Navy has built a ship that's roughly twice as expensive and significantly larger than their largest battleships, and significantly larger than any of the aircraft carriers that came before. The amazing thing to me about Forrestal is that she's the first supercarrier built, and yet modern supercarriers are cut from the exact same cloth. They're very similar in their overall layout. The United States, after operating carriers for less than 40 years, has come to this concept that then keeps them as the dominant naval force in the world for the last 60 years. So, some new features of Forrestal. She has a significantly angled flight deck. A little bit earlier, an Essex-class carrier named Antietam had been modified with an angled flight deck, a slight angle, based on earlier British designs. And it's found that with the angled flight deck, now you can be launching aircraft straight off the bow of the ship, while more aircraft are landing on this angle along the side, which is a tremendous improvement. It means you can launch and recover aircraft simultaneously, and aircraft don't necessarily have to catch one of the wires on recovery because they'll run into the deck park ahead of them. When they hit the deck, they can take off again and do what's called a touch and go, and circle back for another try if things don't go well. Also, with her size, her flight deck is about 4.5 acres of territory. Most American supercarriers have their own zip code. They're so large. And so between her massive hangar deck and this huge flight deck, she's able to carry a similar number of aircraft as earlier fleet carriers, yet they're the modern jet aircraft that are just so much larger. Aircraft like the F-4 Phantom and the F-14 Tomcat, which are some of the largest strike aircraft carried by Navy carriers, are able to operate off of these ships with ease. In fact, on one occasion, Forrestal was able to land and launch a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. Look at this picture of how big this plane is on the flight deck. This Hercules has not been modified for catapult takeoffs or arrestor wire landings. The flight deck is just big enough for this thing to be able to land and take off from the carrier. Does mean you can't have anything in the deck park though, but it's absolutely incredible that mankind made this moving machine able to do that. So the Navy loves a lot of things about the Forrestal and maintains a lot of this in future carrier designs. Another major innovation here is they've moved all the elevators to the deck edge instead of having some on the center line. One, this allows for better structure. There isn't this big opening going through the center line of the ship, and it makes it more difficult for these to be damaged. A number of aircraft carriers during World War II are hit on or near their elevators, and it causes them to drop or be stuck, and that causes all sorts of issues. So the U.S. Navy tests deck edge elevators, really likes them, and with Forrestal decides to go exclusively in that direction. Finally, because of the massive size of the flight deck and how much it overhangs the hull, and because of World War II experience, the Navy chooses to move the main structural deck from the hangar deck, which was the armored deck on World War II aircraft carriers, to the flight deck. This allows the flight deck to be armored and to be the main structural deck, which then further makes sense to move the elevators off to the sides. It does cause some top weight issues. You're now elevating all this armor weight much higher up out of the water. However, the Navy is able to design around that with a completely new hull design, which again is largely unchanged through modern carriers. Original designs for supercarriers do not include an island structure with a bridge and masts. This idea had been tried on Langley, and it was never particularly liked. Venting exhaust gas, the ship is still conventionally powered, so venting exhaust gas has to go somewhere, and you want it elevated above the flight deck, and you need somewhere to con the ship from. So Forrestal's design has changed a couple of times under construction, and finally this conning tower or island is included. And again, all modern supercarriers have it. However, some things the Navy doesn't like about Forrestal. The position of the elevators ends up not working. They've never tested an aircraft carrier with this design flight deck, so turns out the elevators aren't in the best position. At least the elevators work, unlike the modern Ford class, but the Navy doesn't like it, and that's one of the major changes going forward with future classes of carriers. So the forwardmost port side elevator is right at the end of the catapults, which means you can't use it and launch aircraft or recover aircraft for that matter at the same time. So that ends up getting moved further aft, and that makes more sense. Also, there are two elevators aft of the island structure, which is much further forward than you see on modern carriers. This is better for conning the ship, but worse for recovering aircraft and striking them down below. So on all future carriers, the island is moved further aft and one of the elevators is moved further forward. This also means that as aircraft are recovered, you can then roll them forward and use forward elevators to get them down below, as opposed to trying to operate the elevators on the back end of the ship, which you can't do when you're recovering aircraft. Another thing the Navy doesn't like about these ships is the 5-inch guns. Again, they are on sponsons on the four quarters of the ship, two on each side, forward and aft. And this was done with earlier aircraft carriers during World War II. The Navy doesn't like them up on the flight deck because you shouldn't really fire cross flight deck, and then they get in the way of your deck park. But up there with this new hull form, the ships are shipping a lot of water. These are significantly bigger 5-inch mounts than previous carriers had. They're higher caliber, they're in an enclosed mount. So the Navy doesn't like it. However, all supercarriers from then on out retain those positions, slightly different designs, but those are still the weapons positions on a supercarrier. They just don't have 5-inch guns like Forrestal was built with. They have Sea Sparrow missile launchers and phalanxes, which later in her career Forrestal was redesigned to have. When Forrestal is commissioned, she is the first supercarrier, and she is so radically different, so vastly improved from anything that came before her, that her initial year of service is spent training pilots on how to use this new angled flight deck and what the new procedures are going to be for landing on a carrier like this, so that the Navy gets this all sorted out by the time they're able to commission future supercarriers. In fact, this period is when Battleship New Jersey enters the picture. One of the tests that Forrestal is doing is operating aircraft in heavy weather. And it's very common during aircraft operations to have a destroyer right behind the carrier on what's called plane guard duty, so that if a plane has an issue on landing and misses and ends up in the sea, there's a ship nearby that can stop and pick it up. The carrier can't do that. It's a huge object, and it's moving forward, often with the wind, to recover aircraft. So you can't just make those other aircraft circle endlessly. They're going to run out of fuel. So the carrier has to keep doing what it's doing. And this plane guard destroyer could then, much more maneuverable ship, go and pick up the downed pilot. Now the problem is, with rough weather, destroyers can't necessarily do that, particularly the significantly smaller World War II destroyers that were still in service at this time. And so Forrestal's commanding officer called on his old academy buddy, who happened to be New Jersey's commanding officer. And since both ships were operating out of the Norfolk area at the time, New Jersey serves as a plane guard for Forrestal in rough weather. In the end, the tests go off well. New Jersey doesn't have to recover any downed pilots that I know of. And so Forrestal is completely cleared and starts doing a series of showing the flag missions all around the world. The Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, you name it. This ship went there over her nearly 40-year-long career. Because she is born into an age of budgetary battles, and because she is this new and massive vessel that completely outclasses anything anyone else has, either conceptual, under construction, or in service. She spends a lot of time going around making port visits and having people visit. And she sees a ton of presidents and other important politicians and individuals cross her decks over the years. The ship does see service during the Vietnam War and at the end of the first Gulf War. And she does see significant damage during her career, though not directly as a result of enemy action. Forrestal, like many aircraft carriers, suffers from a series of fires over her career. The first and worst one happens on July 29th, 1967.
Well, for the first 20 minutes, we thought we were under attack from the Vietnamese. And it was only then that we found out that the bombs were actually ours going off. You could feel it throughout the entire ship. I worked in the ship's emergency diesels, and our circuit breakers were popping in and out like crazy, trying to keep up with the difference in electrical loads. But for the first 20 minutes, it was kind of scary, Well, going up to the flight deck, I was actually amazed because of the craters that were in the flight deck from those 1,500-pound bombs going off. Most of the crew members that were killed during that were actually sleeping below the flight deck. It was the air crews that were off duty. And when those bombs went off, it just killed them in place. But many, many others injured. People were so severely injured, and yet all they could talk about is their shipmates. Did so-and-so survive? Did this person survive?
During this fire, 134 sailors are killed, 161 are injured, and 21 aircraft are damaged. During aircraft operations off the coast of Vietnam, a missile inadvertently fires from one aircraft still parked on the deck into another aircraft that's fully fueled and armed. And so this fire quickly spreads throughout the armed aircraft on the flight deck, causing severe damage. In fact, it's $72 million worth of damage. For that price, you can buy, in 1967 money, about half of an Iowa Class battleship, and that is roughly a third of the total value of the carrier. So not enough to declare it totaled and get insurance to pay for a new one, but requires significant repairs. The next fire happens 5 years later, on July 10th, 1972, and computer equipment in a computer room near CIC catches on fire and causes significant damage. And then the firefighting effort, spraying water on all this computer equipment, destroys anything that isn't already damaged. And so the carrier has to take all of the computer equipment that's being designated for the new USS Nimitz, then under construction. On 15 January 1978, another fire occurs when a plane crashes on landing. The plane had communications issues with its onboard radio, and the LSO landing signal officer left the meatball on, which would have indicated that the deck was clear for operations. However, it wasn't, and they were moving aircraft around the deck. So when this damaged aircraft comes in for a landing, it runs into aircraft and ends up killing about 10 sailors on the flight deck. A couple months later, on April 8th, 1978, there's a fire in one of the main machinery rooms, number 3 engine room, which the crew promptly is able to suppress using the ship's fire suppression system. And then just a few days later, 1978, on April 11th, there is a fire as a result of catapult steam leaking, which is, again, quickly put out. Finally, a month later, on May 10th, 1978, there is a pump room that gets flooded from a hole in the bottom of the ship. So what you're seeing here is an old ship. At this point, the carrier is more than 20 years old, and so you see a number of equipment failures that result in damage to the vessel. Ships like New Jersey were designed for 20 years of operation. However, with ships as big and expensive as a supercarrier, the Navy starts to use them for significantly longer. Forrestal is going to see just under 40 years of service. Modern Nimitz-class carriers and Ford-class are expected to serve for 50 or 60 years. However, this concept isn't around yet, so the idea of maintaining the ship for that period of time hasn't been fully developed. In order to keep a ship operating, about every 20 years, the ship has to go into the yard for a multi-year, multi-million-dollar, basically a complete rebuild. On the nuclear carriers, they cut out large parts of the hull to be able to replace the nuclear fuel in the reactors. But it's not much less significant of an overhaul for a ship like Forrestal. Sure, New Jersey is around for about 50 years, but she only actually sees about 22 years of service over that time, which is well within the service life of the vessel. Plus, she gets a major rebuild in the 80s. So Forrestal, after 25 years of service, starts to suffer the series of equipment failures, the computer equipment, the steam catapults, the leak in the pump room, that lead to damages, and the ship unfortunately gets several negative nicknames from this, such as USS Forrestal, USS Forest Fire, and USS Zippo. The damage Forrestal receives is in no way unique. Several carriers, including modern supercarriers, suffer damage and fires during high-tempo operations off Vietnam. And many suffer equipment failures that cause damage, like Forrestal did. My personal favorite Forrestal nickname is FID, which stands for First in Defense, because she's named after Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. So I think all of these other nicknames for her are extremely unfair. This is a pioneering vessel, and the Navy is very much learning supercarrier operations from this one. So, in 1982, the Navy, realizing that all these issues are a thing and deciding they want to keep Forrestal in service for a significant period of time past that, does a major rebuild called a SLEP. And this costs about twice the initial cost of the ship, although with inflation it's not quite that. But this shows that to keep these ships in service significantly longer than they're supposed to be, you've got to do major expensive rebuilds. The rebuild of the Iowas in the 80s cost 3 times more than initially building them, not counting for inflation. So paying twice what you initially paid, not counting for inflation, at the same time period, is no surprise at all. This work was done right here at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and it allowed the ship to serve for another full decade up into the Gulf War. And then she was serving as a training carrier. She replaced USS Lexington, which, stay tuned for more videos about Lexington in the future. The Battleship New Jersey crew got to go down and visit her, and we filmed a couple of videos about carrier operations. So if you want to learn more about steam catapults, arrestor gears, landing signal officers, those sorts of things, the carrier group, stay tuned on the channel. Those videos will probably be coming out in January 2022. And then in 1993, after 37 years of service and 22 major operational deployments, the Navy decides to decommission Forrestal rather than operate training carriers anymore. There were major efforts to turn Forrestal into a museum ship.
We've been trying roughly for about 35 years to get the ship as a museum, mainly because she is the first supercarrier. However, money-wise, budget-wise, we couldn't afford it. Every time we went to the Navy to try to get it as an exhibit, it was taken off the donation list, and then we had to go back and redo everything. We don't just continue on where we left off. It's a whole starting process again. And let's see, I guess it's been about a year ago, the committee that was involved in trying to get it finally voted on. You know, the Navy made the choice to sink it. And seeing it, like I say, a week and a half ago, they pretty much gutted it out. It's all rusted inside. It hasn't been taken care of. And I guess the best thing is the resting place is at the bottom of the sea.
One that I'm aware of, because it was in my hometown, was centered around bringing her to Baltimore. And those efforts failed. Then there were efforts to turn the ship into an artificial reef. And the ship was partially prepared for that, and the idea was to sink her around the same time as the aircraft carrier Oriskany, which is, I believe, still the largest man-made reef. However, because so much of Forrestal's design is carried over in modern supercarriers, the reef was not going to be for diving on like Oriskany is. It was purely going to be for marine life to live on, so it had to be sunk in deep water. And because of these stipulations, that fell through as well. And so the ship was eventually, after sitting at the Philadelphia Navy Yard at Pier 4 right next to John F. Kennedy, which we've showed in other videos, she was scrapped at one of the shipyards in Brownsville, Texas. So, which ship was better? This one is a little bit difficult to compare because often in these videos I'm comparing battleships or cruisers like USS Salem, and there just isn't anything like that. Battleship New Jersey has 16-inch guns. By the end of her career, Forrestal had no guns, but she's operating a full air group. Which Battleship New Jersey do we compare? Do we compare 1955 New Jersey when Forrestal is brand new and the two ships operate together? Do we compare 1991 New Jersey, when both ships are at the end of their service lives, but armed with the most modern of equipment? In terms of striking power, Forrestal completely outclasses an Iowa Class battleship. Her air group at any time period gives her the ability to strike targets at significantly greater ranges. If New Jersey is somehow able to remain undetected and attack Forrestal at night, get within range of this ship, and somehow sneak through her carrier battle group and whatnot, she can win in a gunfight. New Jersey's guns completely outclass Forrestal. But that's nearly impossible, and Forrestal's aircraft can operate day or night. In terms of anti-aircraft battery, Forrestal, her aircraft give her a greater anti-aircraft capability. Her onboard capability is fairly comparable. In the 1950s, New Jersey's 40mm guns and 5-inch guns gave her a heavier anti-aircraft battery than Forrestal. However, in the 1980s, the two ships were both armed with phalanxes. New Jersey had more of them, but Forrestal had Sea Sparrow missile launchers, so she could engage missiles at longer range. And so she probably has the better anti-aircraft battery. In terms of protection, Battleship New Jersey has significantly more armor plating, but Forrestal has more interior compartmentalization and could absorb a tremendous punishment. How much punishment? We don't really know. Only one supercarrier has been expended in weapons tests. That's America. And those, for obvious reasons, are still very classified. So presumably a ship of this size can take a tremendous amount of punishment. Well, we know from the various fires that the ship suffers that sinking her is pretty impossible from that sort of stuff alone. So, what ship was the better national investment? There were 4 Iowa Class battleships, there were 4 Forrestal Class aircraft carriers. The Forrestals were more expensive, but operated for a longer period of time. I'm going to go with the supercarriers. The Iowas were the last of the battleships, and as such, didn't really pioneer anything. They were able to find new uses after battleships no longer ruled the waves. However, Forrestal completely pioneers a new and uniquely American type of weapon system, which goes on to dominate naval combat to this very day, over 65 years later. So the lessons learned from operating Forrestal and the nearly 40 years of service and 22 deployments that the U.S. Navy got out of Forrestal, I think makes that ship the greater national investment. And there's a reason why we still have task forces based around supercarriers and do not operate battleships. Which one do you think is the better national investment? Let me know in the comment section down below. Do you think we should still have surface action groups based around battleships, either recommissioned Iowas or a modern type of battleship? Let me know down below. Also, let us know if there are any other ships that you'd like to see in future comparison videos. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like the Forrestal family. Thank you for your support, and again, happy birthday to you, sir. If you would like to support Battleship New Jersey, there's a link in the description below for ways you can donate, or you can support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about our museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.